Hey everybody, welcome to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro class. We are the Winter Spring 2024 class. This is office hour 5. This is just before our break. We've got a little bit of time here. Currently, we don't have any questions. I did, for anybody who's following along, get a reply from Naushad, who is working in northern India. And so we had an opportunity to follow up on that conversation about the elephant-human conflict and a couple of really interesting elements that Naushad has brought up is imperfectly, perfectly starting with non-preferred crop cultivation. So just being conscientious of doing some more unpalatable crops like chili, citrus, bitter gourd, okra, and taro, as well as teasel gourd are non-preferable. So that seemed really important to bring up from a design perspective. Also, the biofencing, growing cane and other species with sharp spines or edges. We do this a lot in urban design. This was actually done quite a bit in the city that I discovered permaculture after I lived. We did a lot of companion planting with spiny plants to allow the plants to grow up because there was a very large parting culture in the area that I was in, and so we had to party proof a lot of the planting. Trip alarms, thin wire entrance was broken, makes a long, loud sound. The chili rope, I did a little bit of research into this, and it looks like the chili rope works really well. I didn't even know it was a potential aspect there, but basically you take chili powder mixed with grease, dry tobacco leaf, and then apply it on ropes along the perimeter. The technique uses locally available and affordable materials, that is, a variety of locally hottest chilies, or in this case, the ghost pepper, as elephants do not like the smell of chilies. So this was a great aspect. This is very similar. This is interesting to see the same sort of approach done in a different climate. This is similar to what Sepp Holzer does in Austria. So Sepp, years ago, when he was a young kid, his father would bring the bone salve man, Bonesalve, bone salve, and he would come and he would take the bones from previously hunted and processed deer. The bones were relatively fresh. They weren't used for cooking before, and he would put them into two Dutch ovens, and he would cake the outside or the seam of the two Dutch ovens with clay, and then he would half bury it in the ground, and they would make this monster fire and let it burn down. And basically, this black tar-like substance would come out of the bone, sort of the marrow, but charred. And he would cut it with a bit of naphtha gas, white gas, and then apply it in a single strip vertically along his trees at the point and above where the highest snowfall would be. And he had almost zero browsing of deer that came into his property on fruit trees. So really interesting to kind of find what is disliked from an animal's perspective. Plantation, elephant habitat, not getting enough food in the forest. Elephants often come to human territory in search of food. Enriched of denuded areas with fodder and shade trees to ensure a favorable environment for elephants, also termed as habitat improvement, efficient way to satiate the need for food and nourishment. This particular method has been implemented by the forest department and has proven to be effective as the elephant's hunger is satiated and they do not venture that far for food. A particular method is effective when large parcels of land are available, or is there enough land to spare? Although I do not have personally implemented or witnessed, another effective method is the salt lick method, where different proportions of normal and rock salts are mixed and spread throughout the area with watering. This has to be done after clearing the land of all shrubs, leaving only mature trees, as it has to be done well outside the boundary. So salt lick reduces the demands of minerals and thus brings them less into where you're cultivating. I'm not sure what method, but we survey the entire corridor to see what attracts the elephants and decides the most suitable method accordingly. For farmland falls in the midst of the corridor, there's alternative corridors, chili rope for biofencing, and force them to alternative ropes. And then Shannon was just super, super grateful because it's been pretty helpful. And then Juan is actually brought in the bee fencing, but then Chana replied that thanks so much for the suggestion. Unfortunately, it seems elephants in my area, Sri Lanka, might be fearful of bees. I tried placing hives around the perimeter. They ended up destroying them each time. Looks like I'll need to explore other multiple options. So had a great back and forth around that, and really grateful we had a chance to do it. As you can see, there are no other questions. So unless anybody else has any other questions, I might go into the water management assignment. and suggest a few ways of going about it to do it well. And then I'm going to make a suggestion, which is not in the course, but I think will be useful for everyone at the end of it. Are there any other questions or any other places that we need to explore before we jump into that?
I'll probably have a question from water,
Okay,
so it can wait.
gotcha. Awesome. All right. So I'm going to jump over to the template. I've had some phenomenal final assignments from the other group that's just finishing today. It's been fantastic to go through them. There'll be a bunch of new examples up within the week after we finish up here. Hey, Nathan, nice to see you. And Ruben as well. Okay. So we're going to run through the assignment here. So the water assignment is really about you getting a sense of what is the water assets on site? How are they operating on site? How much water do you have available to you? What is the flow on site, and to start to think about where and how and why you might capture. It's a relatively straightforward assignment. Drinking water source. So what's your drinking water source? Where does it come from? Is it from the city? Is it from the well? If so, how deep? What's the liters per minute, gallons per minute? If you have rainwater cisterns, pumps, etc., what is there existing on site? Is there a well, borehole? If so, all of those pieces. Wastewater, where does your wastewater go? If you're urban, we want you to get a sense of how that wastewater is treated. One of the reasons that permaculture exists is in modern day culture, we have this magical place called away that we just put all of our pollution, and it's not our problem. And yet it always is, because we're in a closed hunk of rock spinning throughout the cosmos. So we want you, if you're an urban landscape, to really understand where your water goes and what the treatment process is. And then if you're in rural, to also be conscientious about what is the current set. Think of this as the zones assessment before you make any changes. We're just getting a sense. We're just surveying what the water assets are. Then we want specifically the rainfall. Go back to the climate assignment, pull that out. If you can, find record 24-hour. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it just doesn't exist, which is fine. But go back to the climate resources. There's 4 or 5 websites there. It's a good chance you'll find something. Roofing materials. So what's the roofing materials, if any? So what's on the houses? What's on the buildings? Because we're going to be setting up for what's coming in terms of the assessment assignment. Generally, post 5 years, there was 2 studies that came out of Sweden. Oh, I got a hold of them 10 years ago, and they were given to me by Gourd of eco-sense.ca, who's an incredible rainwater harvesting specialist who has a great course on regenerative living online about rainwater harvesting if you're looking for the best rainwater harvesting course I've ever seen. And I took the ARCSA course, which is supposedly the top in North America. But basically, Gourd gave me these studies, and they were about how after 5 years, asphalt shingles have off-gassed sufficiently to then be able to collect water off of. If you were going to drink it, you still have to run it through a potable, but it's definitely at level to be used in gardens or any sort of irrigation conversation. Major impact of precipitation events. So if there's a change in precipitation where you live, if we're starting to see cloudburst, if we're starting to see bigger storms or hurricanes. I was just reading today that the stage is set for potentially a historic hurricane season. So hopefully that isn't to affect anybody here. Watershed maps. So this is the practice sheet. I have a video that tells you exactly how to do this assignment. There's no reason to get this assignment wrong. Those of us who are in this work, we have a back and forth of calling this a watershed versus a water catchment. I would call this a water catchment, but I don't make all the rules. So this is really about a water catchment. It's not a total watershed, and this can confuse people a bit, but basically what we're trying to say is if water flows at right angle to contour, and if you're going at the bottom of the site, how much of this landscape actually flows into or affects this site? Because we want to prime you to get a sense of how much water flows onto your site. When I work with folks and do GIS overlays, we get a sense of what is the total water flow that might flow through or past a site, and if we can harvest it. So this starts to prime the pump on that. Macro watershed is really about seeing the bigger picture. So what's the biggest watershed you live in? And this is the full watershed. And then the micro watershed is really back to catchment. So what is all the water that affects? This is an interesting example because uh, Adria was on a hill, and so she is her water capture. And then this is a great example as well, showing all of the water that flows directly onto site. I talk about it in the tutorial and definitely take a look at it. But if you're in an urban site like this, chances are you're going to have to go outside when it rains to really see if there's any water that affects your site. Because generally we have storm sewers multiple times within a block. So really in this situation, they went halfway up the road because the road always crowns. So basically halfway up the road is kind of a little bit of a watershed. And if you're on a block or a street, you can see if there's more water that comes by. This really pays homage to Brad Lancaster's work and his low impact developments and how we can harvest water off of urban scapes for potential growth. Water site flow analysis. So this is really getting a sense of where does all the water flow onto and off of the site. We just want to get a sense of that big flow. If you're working in a place that has multiple roof areas, this is a great opportunity to split up those roofs as Adria did in between her first site, which kind of gives an overview, and then her second slide that really divides the roof into all the sections that come to a downspout. If your roof doesn't have downspouts, then it's just two pitches, then I would just color them two different colors, call it done. But if you do have downspouts, really think about where all of your water runs, and you can do that by going outside and looking at the gutters and seeing if the gutters are high on one end and low on the other. Generally, you can then get a sense of where the water flows. The idea here is we want to know exactly how much surface area flows into this downspout so then we can do the major calculations to know how much rain per roof area or downspout then flows into your site. Lauren did also a great job here kind of showing those different blowouts. This takes a little bit more time and energy to create, but it's really brilliant to see. So you can see here the 4 pitches of the roof, and then the little hip roof here, and then the blowout. Here, we'll zoom in. And then the blowout is basically where all those downspouts are. So we know that we've got R1, R2, R3, R4, R5, R6, R7, and all of those then come into play in our next couple of slides. This first slide is really about what is the general water site flow. So we want to get a precip chart here. And then we start working with math. Don't get excited. They're very simple. If you're working with metric, you got it easier than the imperial people. That's generally true in all things. I used to take a lot of joy out of making fun of the imperial system, but I don't any longer because, like everything, it's just what we're born with. And in Canada, it's worse because we have both and we have to switch on so many different plays and like it's just ridiculous. Long measurements are in metric, short measurements are in imperial. Because why? Because Canada. So basically what we do is we take the total area. So if you're working in feet, it'd be feet squared. If you're working in metric, it'd be meter squared. Then the yearly rainfall. So in feet and tenths, this is why imperial is problematic for rainwater harvesting. If you're ever going to rainwater harvesting and you're American, you may just want to do your calculations in metric. And then when you buy everything, it's going to be an imperial, but might be useful. And then basically we're getting a sense of what that total rainfall is on the site. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take that split from all those different roof locations. So this is a great example because we've got Adria's here. So we're going to pop back and forth. So Adria, again, she had all the different roof areas, different colors. And then we have all the different roof areas here represented by color as well. Highly recommend you color code this chart. You will be very happy in the future if you ever come back and work on this. And first and foremost, we get the material. Then we take a look at the area. If you are working in imperial or metric, basically put your units up top and then leave this without any units. It just makes it a very clean looking chart. Yearly rainfall, so it's feet and decimals, so it's in tenths. And then maximum rainfall, and then runoff coefficient. So within this slide, as long as I can move over, there's this runoff coefficient table, and that table will take you to a table I created a couple years ago, which basically shows you all of the different potential roof materials and what their coefficients are. There is a range, so you have to make a choice, usually when it's on permeable or impermeable areas. But for roof materials, generally we're looking at our different asphalts, or asphalt's 0.9. So that just means that if 100 liters or 100 gallons fell on this roof, in this case, 10 gallons or 10 liters would be absorbed into the roof or evaporate, and we'd be able to capture 90. So it's just a percentage that gives us a sense of, in terms of that surface, how much can we actually capture off of it? When you get more porous materials like tile roof, that's been there for an awful long time. Tile roof, it's 0.75, because 0.25 or 25% of the precipitation fall that falls on a tile roof becomes absorbed. So it just keeps that conversation. This is actually parallels our conversation about soils and saturation and field capacity. This is kind of that idea of where do we get to saturation when we get to soils. And then similarly, as we move down here, there's a number of different types of material surfaces, pardon me, and they all have their own coefficients. So, and then all of the source material is there. Let's go back here. Great. So basically, you're going to put in your area in feet squared or meters squared, and then you're going to put in your average annual rainfall in either feet or meters, or pardon me, millimeters. And then you're going to put in maximum 24-hour rainfall if you can find it, runoff coefficient. Also, don't leave naked decimals. Don't do that. Yeah, so don't do 0.9, do 0.9. And then you're just going to run the calculation. So all of the calculations are here. If you ever want to create your own sheet, there's actually a Google sheet with metric calculations here. So if you want to use that or make your own and then transfer it in, that's fine. Or if you can just do the math with a calculator, that's okay. And then finally, we've got this extra water assignment. So basically, you go back to your micro watershed, all the water that flows onto your site, and you basically do that calculation just to give us a sense of how much water actually flows onto your site. Now, here's the optional assignment that you don't have to do, but I would suggest would be useful, is start to think about and maybe even make a slide that says, knowing that this is where the water falls on my site, I now am thinking I'm going to do these types of water implementations. I'm going to put an IBC tote, which is a 1,000-liter, 250-gallon, very common unit of shipping liquids in the world. I do not recommend going any smaller. Basically, it's just not valuable in terms of the time and energy put in for the water you get out. A 55-gallon drum or a 45-gallon barrel, they fill up too quick. You use them too quick. It's just, if you're doing it just to learn the process and to prove the model of capturing rainwater and do like a first flush diverter and all of these things, then great, it's fine. But don't think you're going to capture a useful amount of water. The 1,000-liter is even too small for most situations. So generally, I recommend 5,000 liters to start, or what is that by four? 125, yeah, 1250 gallons. But so my suggestion is do another assignment, or do another, not assignment, but a thought process that goes, well, I wonder what I would put and where. And the only reason for that is it primes the pump for the design to come, and I can give you feedback early on. One of the things that needs to be improved within the course, in my opinion, is that we need to have that thought process a little bit earlier. So I'm passing that on to you fine folks as a potential to put in as an optional aspect that you can get feedback on. So also, this is an optional assignment, and I think there's like 3 extra credits that you can get. So if for some reason you lost marks before and you want 3 extra, you can get 3 extra here. That's the water assignment. Questions about the water assignment and its parts? Seems pretty straightforward. Happy, happy, joy, joy, or blank faces.
Just a quick question.
Yeah, Nathan, go ahead.
Did I miss, we're supposed to try and figure out how much, like, for example, my site where I want to measure the water flow that flows by my site, but this river gets quite big. And how would you go about measuring that?
Yeah, so if that were and if there was no pre-existing watershed map of Ecuador. And I don't know if there is, but if there is, you know, spend the time looking for it because it'll be easier than what I'm about to suggest.
Okay,
Generally, those conservation organizations exist, and generally they've mapped the watershed. And from there, you can get an area unit in terms of that site, or better yet, you might be able to get a KMZ file and bring it into Google Earth Pro. So what I've done previously is I've just opened up Google Earth Pro and I've mapped out the watershed by taking a look at the ridges. And I've done this in macro, so I pull way back and kind of get a sense of it. Or I brought in the watershed map of that river. What's the river called? Rio
Rio Ayampe.
Iampe.
Yeah.
Iampe.
Ayampe.
So chances are there's going to be a watershed map of that. It
Mhm.
probably won't have the units you need because it'll be a total flow map that'll come to that point. So what I would do if I was in your shoes is I would get that map. I would import into Google Earth Pro. I would make sure it lines up generally with the borders of where it should be. And then I would outline from your site up to take the full area of that water capture, and that will then give you the area, and then you can do the rainfall, and then the rainforest is relatively low. It's like 0.35, I think, for coefficient. It'll be on that map or that chart. And then you can get a sense of it. So that would be sort of the big of what flows by you. And then there'll be the small watershed that comes up on your site into that hill right behind you.
Okay,
And I would
thank
use
you.
Google Earth Pro for that as well.
I'll take a look and see if they actually have the watershed map.
Yeah. There's a service I don't recommend very much because it's generally based upon poor data. It's based upon the NASA Shuttle Radar Topographic Mission, the SRTM mission that was flown in 2000, where NASA flew the space shuttle over the planet, shot laser beams, LiDAR, lasers bounced back, and they got a sense of generally the topography of the Earth. But the problem is that a pixel size was 30 meters. And so if your site is under 30 meters, then it does the scientific interpolation or guessing of your site, and it can be wildly off. And that's what we use for the contour map generator. And then there's a paid version of that Verge Permaculture put out a while back. That unfortunately is on that same material, on that same data set material. And so it can be wildly off. And the fact that they charge for it is problematic. But it does produce a couple of outputs that might be useful for your site in terms of cost, because you're looking at a big area, and you can basically draw a big square on their service, and it'll give you an output of what's called total water catchment. And basically it'll show you these lines that'll converge onto a site, and they will have different ratings for how much area they're influenced by. So let me pull up an example here. I just did this for another client. Okay, so that was that one. And then where's the outputs? There we go. There we go. So this is the type of map that can be produced. And basically what it does is it shows all of the drainages. And it was really important for these folks because this is that main river that comes in that has like 1,000 to 12, a million to 12 million. It's not a very useful order, that last one, but it's so large at that point, it doesn't matter. But what is really important is that at this point, we have about 10,000 to 50,000 meters squared that actually flows through their property. This is the height of land, and then it moves through. So this potentially could be a place to pick up water, and along this drainage would be a potential place to actually hold water. This can be a very useful map.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I've got a GIS specialist who I work with who can produce these maps if anybody ever wants them or needs them. Obviously not necessary for this class, but if you want them just because you want that level of detail. The Verge Permaculture contour map process, whatever it is, will produce maps like this. Problem is that I've surveyed properties that have gotten this service, and the contours have literally been perpendicular when I've actually gone and done an actual survey. So, they were supposed to be like this on what was produced from their service, and then they were like this in reality. So fortunately, it's not, I don't recommend the service almost ever, but if you wanted to make your efforts a little bit easier and you didn't want to go through the Google Earth Pro conversation, might save you some time. I still think it's rather expensive. I think it's like $50 or something for problematic data that produces problematic results, right? Because if there's error in the data, there's error
Yeah.
in what's produced. So, but yeah, literally it was perpendicular when I went and I surveyed this property.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's how I do it. I would get the map, I'd bring it into Google Earth Pro, because the map itself is what has the actual data in it. And then the XY on Google Earth Pro with the SRTM data is usually under 5 meters, which when you're doing a watershed for a river is fine in terms of error deviation. But then you basically would trace from your property up, just like the watershed practice sheet, and just get a sense of that whole area. And then you'd be like, okay, I'm working with, I don't know, 65, 165, 650 kilometers squared. And when you do the math, you'll have a moment because the amount of water rushing by you is insane.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Especially this year, it was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw my stuff, the email I sent you and the appendix.
Yeah.
But that road that they rebuilt for some strange reason is completely gone.
What did I say? What did I say? I said this to you a month ago.
Yeah, I was
said that
shocked.
road is going to be washed out again. And what happened? And the reason I said it is an important thing from a first principles. While the I told you so is very satisfying to me,
Yeah.
from an educational perspective, what happened is there's a choke point below your site. And
Yeah.
basically when the water, it's just like what happens when a gutter is undersized. So when a gutter is undersized for the flow that comes onto it, it backs up, not because it's plugged with water. Basically, the water cannot flow through the pipe fast enough, so it comes up and over. And that's what happens below you. There's a what's called a control point in water management. And basically that control point hits and then pushes back. And because what we're looking at now is that I don't care where you are on the spectrum of climate change, there's more energy in the atmosphere. And that energy, when it's up there, has to come out someplace. And it's not going off planet, it's staying in planet, but it concentrates and gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And basically, it has to come out in these bigger bursts, these cloud bursts. And so we're seeing a huge amount of rain in a short amount of time. And it's basically pushing everything downstream. And then you get to those choke points that are there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm so glad you didn't invest on that lower side. And as I was telling you before, it's like when you're working with earth bag construction, you really have to be conscientious about not having water wick up the earth bag. And that's what I worry about in your site over anything else is the construction modality you've chosen, plus the local hydrology. It's problematic unless you go like really high up in the landscape.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, we're definitely in discussions about what we could do, if anything, but I don't know, maybe we could talk about it more later.
Yeah, yeah. Any of the office hours, man. Like, I just think if you have that, if you are dedicated to being half or lower down on that property, you're gonna have to go with a different type of build, because you're gonna put in a lot of time and effort, and it's gonna be problematic. It'll get wet, it'll stay wet, it'll mold, it'll create health issues, or it'll erode, which is the other problem. Even if it's concrete stabilized,
Yeah,
because over time, there's these two great images. It's in China or Japan, and there's basically these drips that are coming down on these rocks, and it's like hundreds of years, and they've just tunneled through them. So, if you have fast enough moving water is very percussive and violent in its ability for erosion. We talk about the violence of the raindrop on bare ground, that when that raindrop hits bare ground, it has such an impact that if there isn't any vegetation, it splits up a soil ped. A soil ped is the word we use for a soil molecule. And that's built of sand, silt, clay, organics, biology. And it hits it, it breaks it up, and happens in real time when you have erosive surface flow that basically cuts in.
yeah.
So,
No, I hear you loud and
and
clear.
Yeah, sorry to be the bearer of bad news again.
That's all good.
It's a problem with dreams. They come up against reality pretty quick.
Exactly.
And water does for sure. Any other questions for the water assignment from anybody?
I have like a project specific
Please
question.
go ahead.
My site is on a slope, and basically the entire street is like a water ladder where runoff comes from the neighbor's driveway into the site, and then off the driveway into the next neighbor's site, and so on down the street. It ends up making a lot of wet basements. Would putting a rain garden on the higher elevation side just diffuse water and, exacerbate the problem, or would it be helpful, do you
Right.
think?
Can you put your portfolio in the chat, and that way we can bring it up and just kind of talk about it in real time. So let's talk a little bit about structures. Again, let's go with first principles. So first principles are elements and earthwork elements like swales, hugelkultur, terraces, rain gardens. They all have certain attributes to them. And generally rain gardens as a design element are there to absorb and saturate water into the landscape. So they're not there to hold water. They're porous. They're usually tiered, and they usually have planting that's based upon that tiered structure. So the lower portion are more water loving, the mid portion are medium water loving, the higher portions are less so. But the whole idea is it's porous, it leaks, it's not made to hold water, it's made to hold water as a temporal aspect, so hold it for a little bit, and then it absorbs into the landscape. And this is why so many so many cities have tax incentivization to manage stormwater on site. Victoria, British Columbia, Canada had a tax incentivization for a few years there. I think it's still there, but it's nominal now. It doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. So I'm going to go to your base map, Callista, and kind of pop between that and your other one. Right. I see what you're saying. Right. So basically from the west side, as I see it here, from the west side, water comes onto the landscape and then moves over and then moves down. Is that what's happening?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, there's not a lot of great solutions here. So let's talk about what there is. So generally what you can do is you can make this somebody else's problem, or you can push it to the road. And that would be my suggestion. You don't necessarily want to concentrate the water that completely comes from your western neighbor and shunt it to the back and shunt it down and then have somebody else have a problem here. What I'd probably do if this was a major issue and we were trying to remove as much moisture as possible from the basement is likely put some kind of diversionary drain here. So probably a secondary French drain or an open. So like an open in-ground gutter, probably with rocks to pacify some of the water. I'd probably bring it all the way to the sidewalk, and I would either take a little bit of silver courage and install a metal grate that people could still walk over, but the water could flow over. And I would probably make a little basin within this boulevard garden. I imagine Belmont, Massachusetts doesn't have low impact developments in part of their code. So take a look at Victoria, Canada. They do low impact developments, and they have an entire boulevard gardening and low impact development section of their city code development. And basically have that water then saturate this area, probably do water loving plants here, and then have it pop out here and into the storm drain. Because basically what's happening now is I imagine this perimeter drain gets totally filled and overflowed, full and saturated. And then basically that water moves up and out and probably saturates the whole landscape. So basically the whole landscape gets to saturation, more water falls, comes off the roof, goes into the sides. And the way this was all designed was to concentrate water near buildings instead of not. So I don't know. I don't think the rain garden would do much. If you wanted to have that as a feature, you could probably put it either in the bottom left-hand corner here or in the top corner here, but it would just be more water in the situation that would be held there for probably longer. You probably have a lot of surface water that's there.
Okay.
But yeah, I would think something to the tune of, something that ran this length and then went under. Again, this is a lot of civil courage. I'm not. I'm saying you will have to break laws to do this, most likely, because that's what Brad and others have had to do. And then basically, this would be dug out to have a series of basins in it that would fill, and then that water would eventually. So you'd have kind of a basin and another basin, and then you'd have an overflow that would come out here and into here. But besides that, there's very little you can do in an already saturated situation, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Sometimes when there's just too much water, there's too much water. It's
Yeah.
most of our urban scapes were not built to be responsive or to articulate with our climates. They were built for poor reasons. Another thing I learned about Victoria years ago is that instead of calculating the square footage of the houses, the footprint of the houses for tax purposes, it was changed to the roofs, the roof area for a couple of years. And so all of the roof shrunk in a high rain area. And now we had a lot of infiltration that was coming into the houses. So, generally there's all these really funny things about humans not being responsive to their environments and instead holding different values and conversations. But yeah, that's probably what I would do. I would try to get the water away from on the top side and then out to another place of use, because it is such a small site. There's not a lot of vegetation on the site. But yeah, the other thing you could try to do if you wanted to is really grow a lot of water loving plants. I had a job years ago for a couple of chicken farmers who were in Maple Ridge. And Maple Ridge is on the other side of this rain shadow. So this rain shadow hits Vancouver, and then Vancouver gets a lot of rain, but it's actually a bit of a rain shadow because of Vancouver Island. And then it picks up and it gets heavy. So I think Vancouver's like 1,600 mil and Maple Ridge is like 2,100, 2,200 milliliters, which for you in Massachusetts would be a meter's 3 feet. So like 7 feet of rain.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Wow.
And so basically our big conversation was, they were chicken farmers. They were like, we want you to help us turn water into chickens. So we had a little biblical moment. And basically what we did is we benched the site and did a lot of tree fodder plants. Tree fodder are basically plants that you can feed animals. And we also suggested they should move to ducks because you're in a really wet area and they were getting health issues with the feed of their chickens. So yeah, sometimes it's just how you can produce it. So
Yeah, my site does have a retaining wall on the east side. So that side is also pretty wet and damp, but we have sensitive ferns over there that are thriving. They love it.
I'm sure. That's kind of the suggestion from that example. It's like, what kind of water loving plants that produce a lot of biomass that we can eat, or we can turn into compost, or how can we take this water, turn it into a usable biomass, be it vegetable, fodder, edible, whatever it might be, and then put it into productive use. So that way this water problem becomes a bit of the solution. It's never going to be a total solution, because this is what we would call a type 1 error, an error that you cannot design around. This is where instead of making a plane that either absorbs a bit of water and sheds it, they made a cup. And then they put people inside of it. And then they put homes that degrade when they have too much water near them. So that can be the issue on the long term. There is such a thing called type 1 design errors, and sometimes you can't design around them. You just have to go say, okay, this is something I have to deal with, and I'm going to have to work with this. One of the things I find a lot in tropical regions that have a high precipitate or a high percentage of poisonous snakes and animals is mulch is a very contentious issue, because mulch can create a huge habitat for these types of animals to be close to humans. And generally in these areas, Kenya is one of them, you go to their farms and they've swept the dirt bare. There's no place for a snake to hide. And so there's this conversation, this conflict of like, well, then how do we use mulch? And generally snakes are going to want to be around dry mulch. And so we do a lot of living mulches in those situations where we do a lot of structured mulch so that we have ground covers and other elements where it absorbs and holds onto water. But yeah. Shawani, hey Javin, my site has just one structure at this point. Rest of the structures are not built yet. So do I do calculations for only one roof? Yes, absolutely. So what I would suggest is do 2 or 3. And if you only have one, do 2 or 3 of what you propose you're going to create. Because we do want you to at least develop a comprehensive understanding of how to do these calculations, because it's the beginning of a water management plan. So yeah, that would be fine. Thanks, Shawani. Great question. Any other questions?
Javin, as always, I have the opposite problem,
Yeah.
which as I go through, like reading the sample projects, looking through the permaculture textbook, etc., I see a lot of examples of places that are arid, but they get monsoon or they get flood. So you look at like sort of the American Southwest, and they often will get flash floods. Whereas I get nothing like that. I actually went back to November 2020 before I found a single day that got more than 6 millimeters of rain.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just barely, it was maybe 6.5 millimeters.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's like 3 years back before I found a single day with over half a centimeter of rain. So the site, yeah, it just doesn't get the with any great frequency at all. There's no like seasonal flash floods or anything like that. So, which is fine. I understand that's my water problem, but what I'm trying to think of is then what plants to use. And I'm not finding a lot of parallel examples of plants that can deal with pretty substantial cold and extremely substantial dry and quite substantial heat. So if you have any thoughts
Yeah.
on plant resources, that'd be great.
Yeah. So generally what you're going to be working with is you're going to be working with arid, xeriscaped natives.
Mm-hmm.
And basically your site, I had a brainwave about this a couple days ago. I
Really?
woke up, I was in a deep sleep, having a totally different dream, and somehow your project popped into my mind in that liminal state between consciousness and dream. And there's a great project called the Albida Project that was created by Neil Spackman. Um, and so much of that was about the potential for rain, about being ready for when rain came. And so he did a lot of one rock dams within drainages that would slow and pacify water. So that way there wasn't a flash flood, and
Yeah.
that there would be some transit time behind the rock structures. So that way they would hold, they would silt, and they would sink in. And basically he did a water accounting process where he said, if we have this much amount of rain, we can pull this much amount of water out of the fossilized aquifer, and we can use that upon the landscape, to the
Mm-hmm.
point to where he got an establishment of grass. And once you get grass going,
Mm-hmm.
grass usually has a condensation aspect both above and below ground and holds onto water. And I think that would probably be the way I would approach your site. Is I would be approaching it in a probably decade-long successional conversation of how do I start basic vegetation that can operate within the condensation in the morning, which does happen
Mm-hmm.
in your area. It's the other reason I brought that up was rock mulch, is that
Mm-hmm.
I've used rock mulch in the Okanagan before, which didn't occur to me before this moment. Um, to condense around small trees to basically give them a little bit of condensate in the morning.
Okay.
But also it helps to protect that site from wind, which that site does get. The whole Okanagan gets some pretty interesting katabatic and anabatic winds that come through there. So I would probably focus on that. I would focus on making sure that those structures are in place for when it rains, because it will. You'll
Mm-hmm.
get an event at some point, and that'll
Yeah.
be an issue.
Yeah.
And then working with anything that will build biomass in the soil at that
Mm-hmm.
point, because you want to be hands off from a watering perspective. So basically, it would be installation in the fall before the major rains of that area come,
Mm-hmm.
or using the snow itself to pack down the seed, water in that area, let it go into dormancy, and then let it sprout in the spring.
Right.
Yours is a longer time frame of a project site because your water resources are so slight.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I was looking into years ago was I don't know if you get the same level of fog as a Soyuz does. Do you?
No.
No, no. Because I was working on a project in a Soyuz, and in some of those benches, the fog in a Soyuz is insane.
Hmm.
We were
Wow.
looking at fog nets like they use in Ladakh and Mongolia and Tibet. Because it's a very similar. Probably what I would do if I was in your situation is I would look to designs in the arid Southwest. I would take a look at Tucson, New Mexico, Utah, and then I would probably look for some indigenous solutions that came out of Ladakh, Mongolia, and Tibet in terms of establishment of hyper arid situations. And you're not, funny enough, your site is not hyper arid. It feels like that to us in Canada because we get a lot of other precipitation.
Uh-huh.
And then the last thing I would say is there's a process and a conversation with snow fences that may or may not have value for you. I know Soyuz is getting more snow every single year, and keeping it shaded from the sun so that way it sinks instead of sublimates. Sublimation is when snow goes from solid to gaseous and skips liquid altogether. But this was a process that was used for a long time in Alberta. Farmers would use snow fences to collect snow, and they would design them in such a way so that they collected them. And the snow fence itself provided some shade from the sun. So that way that snow would actually sink down. And those can be those little areas that you start small little plantings, kind of these, I think we talked about it last time, this idea of a coral reef idea. You can find as small pockets of moisture or small indentations. We'll start there and then grow out from there. The other solution, which I don't know if we talked about last time, was the fish scale straw swale. Did we talk about that? Okay. Yeah, I think thinking about that more, I was thinking that's probably a really good place for you to play, as well as looking through all those case studies from the low tech erosion control course on that landing page. I think that would be useful.
Okay. Yeah, like I've been thinking so far around sort of minimal irrigation augmentation, like the thing of trying to do cover grasses, for example, to try to build organic matter in the soil as quickly as possible. Because there is 200 millimeters of rain or rain and snow every year, which is not a tiny amount of water. Like it's halfway to a real irrigation situation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've been thinking about trying to get organic matter soon as being a real priority in the soil.
Yeah, and really look for those C4 grasses that are native to your area. The ones that work.
Yeah.
There we go. Really look for those C4 grasses in that area that are productive. The local conservation associations will have a list, and chances are they usually will support anybody who wants to put anything back to native. So chances are you can find funding for at least seed, if not planting. It's just being conscientious about when you plant and what kind of mulch you can find to help support that. Mulch is going to be a big deal on your site.
Right. Yeah, there is good native bunch grass growing on the site. So it's kind of what can I do to help that?
Yeah.
And what can I do to improve it,
Yeah. And that's where things like the fish scale straw swale. There's no swale in that. I always put it in. Neil makes fun of me. Yeah, that would make a good idea. And then any sort of structures that can hold on to that water. Hugelkultur makes perfect sense on your site when you get the rain. And especially around the house, like every drop that falls on that site should be going to some kind of planting that will hold on to it longer than you'll see it on the landscape.
Yeah. And there's 100,000 liters coming off the roofs, so it's not nothing at all. So on hugelkultur, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
On hugelkultur, so the site has these creek cut benches, and so all of the benches, like there's this side slope that might be 10 12 feet, 15 feet of angle, 30 to 45 degree angle. It's often kind of rocky,
Yep.
often lots of cactus. Like it's been a wasteland sort of thing. And so that seems like just a really logical place to put hugelkultur for me, to just dump wood waste on. But I'm wondering if it works on that slope or if the hugel really needs to be at the bottom of the slope.
Well, like the inflection point of any of that is going to be the better spot. Like
Yeah.
that little fertile crotch, if you will, is always
Uh-huh.
going to be where you're going to find most amount of moisture. So because your site is a bit more on the extreme side, I'd probably start where the flywheel of ecology is already starting
Mhm.
and work out from there.
Okay.
Generally, if you folks are thinking about producing your own food or producing any sort of supplementary food, what I'd probably do is put tanks around the house as much as financial input can afford,
Mhm.
and then have overflow that goes into and onto hugelkultur. So that way, once that volume is filled, the overflow of that is going directly into long-term storage, which in your environment in 5 years will be some of the best soil in that area. And
Mhm.
then you can do it again. You could harvest all that soil, use that for long-term plantings and then start again.
Right.
And that would be sort of the 5-year flywheel of like, we're going to design these, put this water in here. We're going to grow as much as we can out of it. We're going to produce fantastic high organic matter soil, high water holding capacity soil. And then we're going to use that for the next planting. So that way you leapfrog every couple of years in terms of
Mhm.
what's being produced.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No worries. Yeah. Your site is a great one for just every single water retention tool and technique and strategy that we have, because you guys got 5 people on site potentially.
Yeah. Yeah. We will have 5. Yeah.
5. So 5 on site, taking a look at a food calculator, you're looking at a fair amount.
Mhm.
But if you can hold on to that water, like 100,000 liters of water is enough for a veggie garden twice over for a family of 5 for a year.
Uh-huh.
It's the water you need. And
Yeah.
you have a well, so you have supplementary.
Mhm.
But basically it's a coral reef. Here are the people, here's where we can sink water. We'll do this for a few years, we'll practice and we'll get our skill level down, and then we'll expand, and then
Mhm.
we'll apply, and then we'll expand and we'll apply. And then anything else in the farther reaches of the site, I would put in things like the low tech erosion controls or the low impact controls that are situated from the Coavera Coalition Erosion Control Field Guide, which is in the Q&A document at the top. Um, and do those as little Saturday projects, get a couple friends
Mhm.
over, bring everybody out, do a small test trial. And then I would do a lot of monitoring on your site. So I would either get GPS kit for iOS or I would get Gaia GPS for Android, take photos of that same spot in that same location, bring it into Google Earth Pro, have um, full timestamps of all your monitoring logs, and then have some data points to actually come back and start to do some intensive observations. That way you can see what's working, what isn't.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
I think it'll move it in the right direction, man. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
when we want to be on sites or we have opportunity like you have to be on sites and they're not ideal, creativity starts to come pretty quickly. So
Mhm.
yeah. That was my situation. Like I think we only have about 150 mil more than you, one valley over.
Mhm.
And I wanted to have as much water capture as I could, and that's why I made those shop huga cultures. I think I've talked about them before.
Mhm. Yeah.
But that was the same thing for everything. It was always about vegetative cover. It was about, if we did raise boxes, having hoops over them so that way I could put remate over it in the hot time of year, because
Mhm.
shade cover is going to be a big deal for you.
Mhm.
And I'd probably think about actually, Peter Janes and I were talking about this when we did the Propagating Woody Edibles course on regenerative living, about bringing in some large scale netted and on slides mesh over cover. So
Mhm.
basically you can pull that mesh over, increase shade by I think 45%. They have like 25, 45, 65 and 85% shade cover.
Mhm.
Um, but that would probably be a good investment early on. So that way you can temper the heat up there, July, August, getting into
Yeah.
June now as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that'll save you probably 40% of your evapotranspiration. because it
Uh-huh.
mimics that understory of canopy, right?
And is that yeah, I guess you might think of tree I don't know, like yeah, well, forest gardening. Like if you intercrop trees and vegetable garden, then you get shade from the trees, but the trees of course drink a lot of water.
Ton.
So is that a good idea or is just the shade cloth?
That's why I suggested the shade cloth and
Right.
not tree crops that are going to take a long time to grow and are going to be a while before they produce valuable shade or
Uh-huh.
viable shade. So like I did a project in Cuba. Funny enough, they just went back to it and another tornado or hurricane ripped it all out. But we had all of these beds on contour, and then we had Moringa oleifera. So we had the moringa trees that are fast growing in year one, produce a ton of shade. So they were there during the summer. They cut them down during the winter, and then they grew back up during the summer. So they were this revegetative shade structure.
Mm.
In temperate climates, we just don't have the growth rate to bring that as
Mhm.
quickly as we could.
Mhm.
So I'd probably just go with shade cloth. And if you
Mm.
could, and if you've got the money for it, doing like a steel structure with cables that then you can just slide it up and slide it back. So that way, when the wind picks up, you can put it back, tie it up, done. And then
Yeah.
when those still days that sailors dread come up and it just bakes your site, you can pull it up. And then it'll also be an okay place to be outside during that time because without many trees, you're going to have
Mhm.
solar sails are going to be a valuable piece for outside enjoyment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been wondering about making essentially shade cloth houses for all the residences,
Uh-huh.
you know, to try to put another skin between the sun and the house.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Hmm.
100%.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. It finally happened. Does anybody else know that this happens? Amazing. Google has finally put in an accordion function. I am very excited about this. Somebody just asked about iOS versus Android apps, and specifically the one I was talking about is GPS Kit. So this is for site photos that can be imported into Google Earth Pro. Then Android is Gaia GPS. Uh, site photos, and I'm just going to make the point of saying geo referenced site photos, and this is the same for this as well.
And do you need any extra like plugins for your phone, or do they just all have the GPS equipment inside them and you just need an app to activate it?
Exactly. So 5, 10 years, if your phone is younger than 10 years old, the the inclinometer and the GPS tracker inside the phone itself is enough.
Hmm.
Yeah, you can always add GPS relevancy to a phone. I was looking at this tool a couple years ago. It was called the ELF Surveyor, Bad ELF Surveyor, and it increased my phone's resolution to I think sub 5 centimeters or something silly like that. It's like $600-700. And if you're on your site, the 5 meter deviation from your phone is enough. It's like people get obsessed about accuracy on things that don't need accuracy. But that whole field has exploded, and now there's like 8 different devices that when I was like, oh, next time I'm gonna make a purchase, I think I'm gonna pick it up, and there's like 7 I have to go through now and do the evaluation of again and all the rest of it. And my mentor, Darren Doherty of the Agrarians, still, of course, like all mentors do, they have their one piece of technology that they bought 10 years ago and they just keep using the same one. So they're not the right person to ask because the innovation goes quick. So it's a lot of hounding and sniffing out what's going on Reddit and Trustpilot and all of those and YouTube forums. But at some point I'll get there. All right, folks. Any other burning questions before we call it quits for this call? All right. Pleasure to see you all. One little caveat is I'm on vacation 2 days after you submit your next assignment. So I will mark on the Monday and half of Tuesday. And if you're not submitted by then, I'll be marking when I come back after the break. I highly, 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 highly recommend you work through the break and you just get on top of or advance yourself throughout the course. Future selves will thank you, because once you get to the design assignments, you've got a huge amount of time in front of you. So if you can work through the break, I would, just to get yourself a little bit further in advance. If you finish early and you want to submit early, feel free. I won't be marking until I'm back and working on that weekend before we start. Other announcements, we've got some great courses coming up with regenerative living. We just finished the aesthetic design for ecological landscapes course. So if you're wanting to approach design from a more aesthetic standpoint, Jamie Wallace of Jan Designs, who's been designing landscapes for 40 years, just finished that course. It'll be up for self-paced work probably within a couple of weeks. And then we have the hedgerows, designing and implementing functional hedgerows with Jude Hobbs, who's been designing hedgerows for 20 years. That's coming up in just under 30 days, April 20th or 10th. Chances are you don't want to add anything more to your learning cycle right now, but I wanted to let you know all the same. And again, all those courses will be available after the fact. Basically, regenerative living is what I wish I had when I started, so I could just take a course and learn about rainwater harvesting and go too. So all of those great things are coming up, as well as 2 webinars. We've got a webinar with Mark Krawczyk talking about coppice agroforestry, tentative to the end of April. He's installing a big job, so we're going to have to see and wait. And then we've got another one coming up in May that I'm excited for, but is a secret until it's totally confirmed. So some fun stuff coming up. What are people taking away from the conversation today? What was the value of joining the call?
I really love the intro, like the whole thing's been interesting, but I really love the intro on and thinking about Callista's problem with water as well was super interesting for me. But the intro about the elephants, I just thought was so interesting, and all the different strategies, like there was like 5 different, not just like you can plant oranges or lemons or grapefruits, but it was 5 completely different approaches, which I thought was super interesting. And it reminded me of a story that I shared about the elephant problem. I was researching, we have walnut trees here, and the squirrels take every single nut. If you ever find a walnut sitting on the ground, it's because it's empty. There's like the squirrels take every single nut. And so I was trying to figure out how to get walnuts, and I was doing a bunch of Googling, and I found a walnut farmer who had planted 2 different varieties, one which ripened earlier than the other. And so the early ripening walnuts were just all for the squirrels. They were sacrificial walnuts for the squirrels. And then the squirrels would be all fat and happy, and he could harvest the rest of the walnuts. So I thought that was super interesting. And I thought about it when the elephant conversation came up. But to hear just the broad range that is already being applied historically and effectively was just super interesting.
Awesome, Ruben. Yeah, that's this idea of diversity is not just diversity in species, it's diversity in time. So that way you have things that come on during different seasons, and you basically feed whatever is inherently around and potentially a pest pressure, or you deter them. So a thing I picked up from a strawberry grower years ago who had these swallows that would come by and just decimate his crop is he would put out all these little red rocks really early in the season, and all the swallows would be like, nope. Little red things on the ground are not edible. And so when the strawberries came on, he didn't have the same level of predation. There's just a lot of avoidance. So yeah, thanks. Anybody else? What are you taking away from the call today? What's valuable?
Shattering my dreams there, Javin. I'm just
I
kidding.
shattered your dreams months ago.
No, it's funny because the raised super Adobe cylinders. I've been talking to some super Adobe people and other people who all thought it was a good idea, but I do see exactly where you're coming from. Like this one super Adobe guy told me if I was going to do that, to apply a very robust plaster to the outside and inside. And I also thought, if I built a cylinder that's going to support the home and then did this balcony out of super Adobe, that would kind of protect the cylinder. Like that cylinder potentially never would come in contact. And one of the reasons we were going to build with this was because of the price point, basically.
Sure.
But I was wondering, now that I'm talking about it, would you suggest just like pillars, concrete
Yep.
piles, and just build up off that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
stilts, basically.
Stilt.
If you don't want to move the facility area higher up in the landscape, if you want to keep it where it is, where it's effectively in the danger zone for
Yeah.
back flooding from that control point, then yeah, I would raise things up. I would do what indigenous people have the world over when they're in flood areas, is they use stilts.
You just use the stilts, yeah.
They just get above it.
Yep, I got you. Is there anything, because the way they built that road back in 2012, like you said, it create that choke point. But is
Mhm.
there any other ways, like obviously intelligent design methods, where you could further upriver before water ever reaches the town or our land, alleviate this pressure point?
Mm. It's a good point, and it's a really good thought.
Mhm.
You would have to then get on board the individuals within that watershed and universally go, we need to capture and store this water within this watershed. So that way
Yeah,
we're not having this flash flood further downstream. It would be a colossal undertaking. It would be the work of a lifetime to basically say, I'm adopting this watershed so that way we can apply smart water retention structures and practices, so that way that water sinks in and grows food and does all the things it needs to, and doesn't negatively affect people downstream. And some incredible, courageous people do that. They spend their lives having those conversations and helping people understand it and creating that peace. Beyond that, at that scale, anything else is going to be a drop in the bucket because of the volume, I imagine. And hopefully you'll go through that process and give me a sense of what that catchment looks like. But I imagine it's going to be kilometers in terms of the area. And again, once you add those numbers up, once you add annual precip, area, and then coefficient, you're getting into the probably tens or hundreds of megaliters or more in
oh
a
yeah,
site like that. So that's a lot of water to come down, and always brings me back to I was driving in a car in Montana with Sepp Holzer because we were going up to this Sage Mountain Retreat Center, I think is what it was called. Um, and Sepp is a unabashed human. He calls stupidity as he sees it. He called me a dumb cuff many times as I was asking questions that he felt were dumb. Because in Germany and in Austria, you can ask dumb questions. And as we were going up this valley, this road was snaking in the valley. And he goes, people are so dumb. I put roads in valleys. Valleys belong to water. People are so dumb. Valleys belong to water. And that stuck with me for years. And so whenever I was in a site, it was like, we're going to build the such and such in the valley. It's like, cool. Did you want the water to take it this year or next year?
yeah,
And it became a bigger conversation because if we don't, and this is where the PA Yeoman's permaculture or agriculture scale of permanence for all things agricultural, third time's a charm. Climate's up top. Climates are the rules of the game. Geography is second. It's the board game. It's where we play the rules of the game on. And so when that precipitation falls onto the landscape and goes through all the places that the geology and the geography request it goes there regardless of our wants or feelings. This is where a mentor of mine years ago liked to say when I was upset with something, he goes, ecology doesn't care about your feelings. And so this water that comes down these little pathways doesn't care about the care that you've put into your buildings, just doesn't care. And so if you got everybody involved, sure, that might happen. This happened during the 2013 floods of Calgary, I want to say. Major floods, they basically rip wrap the Bow River that came from the Rocky Mountains all the way to Calgary. Rip wrap is basically bank armament for riparian areas. And they channelized the water so that way when it was overloaded and shot into Calgary, which is on a floodplain, it wiped out these huge neighborhoods. And we were going to a Mark Shepard workshop that Dakota Cohen and his dad brought to, now called Cohen Family Farms, then it was a different name. And we were driving through the area just near Canmore, where there's this huge rock escarpment that they put up. And I worked in the parks. I was there. I saw it all the time. And I always thought it's such a weird design. That all washed out, and we drove by, and I was uncontrollable. I was uncontrollable for a good 10 minutes. I just was giggling. They put everything back in exactly the same place. All of these control structures that totally didn't work, that were a total waste of time and money, they put back exactly how I remembered them. And I saw the photos of the destruction because I was on the West Coast at the time. I came back and it was just destruction. And the people who were in the car were also permaculture designers. And they're like, what are you going on about? I'm like, you can lead a human to water, but you can't make them think. So generally, humanity is far-sighted. That makes everything else, that makes moles look nearsighted, which makes moles look farsighted because we just don't think ahead. So fortunately, in your situation, there's the choke point. You can't change that. There's the watershed behind you. You can't change that. The only thing you can change in your site is where you place and how you design those buildings. And I would design them for flood, is what I would do. Kind of like when we talked, I designed your whole site with flood in mind, as if it's
Mhm.
going to happen. And if it doesn't, great. But if it does, you're prepared for it. So generally, we want to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And it definitely carries over into regenerative land design.
Right on. Did you, any chance you still wanna make a trip down the coast?
Hey man, I'm going to keto next week.
Oh, enjoy. What are you doing there?
Just vacation. I want to go check out Mindo, the cloud forest, and Cotacachi, and the largest indigenous handicraft market in South America, and all the different volcanoes. There's so many cool volcanoes up there. I don't know if you caught it, but Fernando is erupting, or was erupting on March 3rd.
Yeah. Is that the one on the in the Galapagos?
Yeah, that's right. So the way the Galapagos is, there's a hot spot and it basically produces the islands. And as you have tectonic shift, basically it's printing the islands and the islands are moving this way. And Fernando's on the far west side. And it's not the newest, but it's one of the newer ones. And I love that geological form is always being produced. It's very cool.
Crazy. Well,
Yeah.
enjoy your vacation there. It's a beautiful area.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, folks. We're definitely over time. Thanks for your time. It was great to chat. If you have any questions about any of your assignments, feel free to reach out to me this week, javin@allpointstodesign.ca, and have fun. Have fun with it. The looser you hold this, even though it's serious, the easier it comes. It took me years to learn that. But if you can play with your designs and design them again and take more transparency paper or a new layer and just draw something interesting, you'll find that the looser you hold your hand in your mind, the easier the connectivities come, because we are ecological in nature and we have to make those connections to make good connections. And eventually everything's wrong. Eventually nature shows you that you definitely put it in the wrong place and you gotta move it anyways. So try and avoid that at some point. Thanks, Shawani. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. All right, folks, great to see everybody. We will chat again in a few weeks' time when we're all back from break. Make sure to work through break if you can. If not, take a break. And if you do work ahead and you want to submit, please do. Great to see everybody. Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Yeah.